Multitrack mixing seems like it should be easy, but it's not. It's hard. And one of the most difficult things about mixing is managing low end. Most engineers have struggled with this at one time or another, and it usually goes something like this. 1. The mix sounded great in the control room, but when I listen on my little desk radio, I can't hear the kick or the bass at all. Or 2. The mix sounded fine in the control room, but when I listen in my car, it's all muddy and the low end is all over the place. Now, because both of these problems start with the sentence, "It sounded fine in the control room," many conclude that the problem must be the control room. Well, maybe, but not necessarily. Not that the acoustics and the quality of your monitoring system aren't important, they are. But having taught students how to mix for the last 22 years, I can tell you that these problems crop up even when you have a good control room. So for the sake of this discussion, we're going to leave control room acoustics and monitors out of it. I do not want to get in the business of telling people which monitors they should be using. And don't you dare start a monitor debate in my comment section. Get off my lawn. I mean, some of the most heated arguments I've seen in online forums have to do with control room monitors. Seriously, people resort to flat out name calling because they think their Genelec 8350 sound better than the Event 2030s. I mean, for f***'s sake, of all the things to argue about, never mind. I'm going to show you 3 mixing tips that can help you to manage low end. Number 1, mix flat. One of the biggest hurdles to overcome is that we like to mix the way we listen. That didn't make sense. Let me explain. Most people tend to make some kind of EQ adjustment to their own personal listening system, like cranking the hell out of the bass or making the treble super sizzly. Or that stupid smiley face with the graphic EQ. Don't get me started. And that's fine. People can listen to music in whatever manner they want. But when you step into the control room, you need to think flat. And I'm not just talking about flattening the EQ in our system. We need to flatten the EQ in our heads. And here's how you do that. First, make sure your studio equipment EQ is flattened and properly tuned. Don't embellish the low end. Then listen to some music that you're familiar with, and make sure that the player you're using has its internal EQ set to flat or off. Now, just listen, and pay particular attention to how it sounds compared to how you prefer to listen to music. Many people are surprised to hear what their favorite song sounds like in the control room. The low end is there, it's just not boosted into oblivion. That's what I'm talking about, and that is the way we need to mix. Mix your songs with the knowledge that the consumer is going to add their own EQ to their personal listening system. If you've already cranked up the bass in the mix, it's going to be doubly bassed up in their system, and that's where the mud comes from. Well, that's one of the places where the mud comes from, but we'll get back to that. Number 2, listen through alternate monitors. I've always said that every control room needs a good pair of speakers. Or is that a pair of good speakers? Whatever. One of the great thrills of mixing in a good control room is the extended bass response. Unfortunately, that can also be a hindrance to us when we're learning to mix. You see, the kick and the bass often have a disproportionate amount of low end in them. You don't have to push the fader that much before it seems like you have plenty in the mix. The problem is, it's all low end. You're not getting enough of the mids and the highs of the bass guitar in the mix. And even though it sounds fine to us in the control room, not everyone has speakers that go all the way down to 30 Hertz. In fact, a lot of people are listening to music through the little speaker on these damn things. We're going the wrong way. So to help us get an idea of what our mix is going to sound like in the average listener's system, it's a good idea to occasionally switch to a pair of monitors that sound like the average listener's system, which generally doesn't produce much below 100 Hertz. Auratones or Yamaha NS10s have been popular choices for years, but whatever you choose, here's my suggestion of how to use them. Once you've established a rough mix, switch to the smaller speakers and listen carefully to the kick and bass. Can you clearly hear the bass part? Another trick is to mute the bass track. If it doesn't sound like you turn anything off, then it's getting lost in the mix. So, turn up the bass until it sounds right in the smaller speakers. Now switch back to your main speakers. At this point, it will probably sound like the bass is too loud, but what you're really hearing is the bass guitar's overabundance of energy in the low frequencies. This can be easily corrected with a shelving EQ. Just cut enough so it tames the low end in the big speakers. Now as you switch between your monitors, you should have a nice consistent bass in both sets of speakers. You can use this same approach with the kick. Listen to it on the little speakers. Does it have the punch you want? Can you hear that sharp point on the attack? If not, turn it up until you do. Now go back to your big speakers and shelf down the low end if it's overpowering. If the kick sounds boxy, you may need to apply some cut EQ to the mid-range as well, usually around 1K. Side note, if you're having trouble getting a good kick drum sound in the recording process, it might be time for the drummer to change their beater head. Check out my kick drum video for more about that. And number 3, pay attention to the low end in the non-low frequency instruments. Ideally, this is something that should be taken care of in the recording process, but as I've mentioned before, that's a lot easier said than done. I mean, have you ever asked a guitar player to turn down the bass on their amp? Give it a try, let me know how it goes. The point is, there are many instruments in our mix that have some energy in the low end, and they may sound fine by themselves, but when you add them all together in the mix, that low end builds up, and that's the other source of our mud. So don't be afraid to apply a little bit of cut EQ to reduce the low end energy in these instruments. You might be surprised to see how much it cleans up the low end in the mix. Although you'd be well advised not to do this while the band is watching. And one more thing before we wrap this one up. If you want to learn more about mixing and managing low end, I put a link in the description to Jason Moss's Behind the Speakers website. This is a great article about managing low end and a trick to making your big speakers sound like little speakers. Just in case you didn't want to go out and buy new speakers. Because, you know, stuff costs money. But hitting the subscribe button is free. One of the most difficult things about mixing, or speaking, is speaking. I don't know how to operate this thing with the buttons on it. But having taught students how to mix... Not that the... Seriously, people, people resort to flat-out name-calling because they think their Genelec 8350 sound better than the... I'm going to show you 3 mixing... Well, I held up 5. Did I hold up 5 hands and say 3? 5 fingers and say 3? 5 hands. I have 5 hands.
I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
That's just so stupid. This many. And I'm not just talking about flattening the EQ in your system. We need to EQ the flatten. We need to... My skull isn't flat enough. We need to... The same line. We need to flatten the EQ here. My face is the most important thing, of course. There's the money right there, boys. Mix your songs with the knowledge that the consumer is going to add their own EQ to their own listening system. How many times can I say own in a row? Your own. No. If you've already cranked up the bass in the mix, it's going to be doubly bassed up in their... Your it's going to be bassed up in there. And it'll be... Oh, I can fix that. I can fix that in the mix. The oratones. Or they're actually avantones. Oratones are it. Oratones are... Side note, if you're having trouble getting a good kick drum sound in the recording process, you might want to have the drummer do something. Anything. Okay. One more thing. Yeah. Okay. One more thing, man. Roll it. This is a great article about... Article? Okay. Am I having a stroke? Am I okay? My face isn't drooping, is it? Okay.